I wonder by my troth what thou and I did till we loved. Were we not weaned till then, but sucked on country pleasures childishly? Or snorted we in the seven sleepers' den? 'Twas so. But this all pleasure's fancies be. If ever any beauty I did see, which I desired and got, 'twas but a dream of thee. And now good morrow to our waking souls, which watch not one another out of fear. For love all love of other sights controls, and makes one little room and everywhere. Let sea discoverers to new worlds have gone, let maps to other worlds on worlds have shown. Let us possess one world, each hath one and is one. My face in thine eye, thine in mine appears, and true plain hearts do in the faces rest. Where can we find two better hemispheres, without sharp north, without declining west? Whatever dies was not mixed equally. If our two loves be one, or thou and I, love so alike that none do slacken, none can die. The Good Morrow. Welcome to Professing Literature. Welcome back. We are in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, in the year of grace 2024, and we are coming to you tornado-free. A beautiful summer evening, and I know some of you are on tenterhooks after our last episode, wondering if Eric's house was picked up by the cyclone and deposited on top of a munchkin in the land of Oz. There was that night a little bit of drama to the southwest of us, but it didn't come near either the Anderson or Williams residence, so we had nothing to complain about. Blessings to all of those who did get a bit of a shake-up that night. But that's just the sort of built-in drama that Professing Literature contains. So I should say, as I generally do, Professing Literature is the podcast where we look closely at short passages of important works of literature in the hopes of seeing writers in action. We aim to work across literary genres and modes, comedy and tragedy, drama, poetry, fiction, looking at the dynamics of a passage in order to understand what the author is doing and what is at stake for the work or for his corpus as a whole, the issues that it clarifies, the techniques that are involved. I am David Anderson. I'm a professor of Renaissance literature at the University of Oklahoma in the Department of Classics and Letters. With me this evening, driving the bus, is Mr. Eric Williams. Hello, Eric.
Hello, David.
Our podcasting venture goes from strength to strength. Nothing's going to stop us. I was saying to Eric, I had a little bit of a hiccup when my OU-issued laptop's monitor died last week, but that doesn't really slow us down. So I'm like Walter Cronkite reading the news off of paper, if you can hear that. It's a little bit different. It's actually how I lecture in class. I don't use a laptop in class, so I don't know why I'm even complaining about it, Eric, but
yeah,
it's a little bit of a different feel.
Well, I did accuse you of being old-fashioned.
Yeah, well, now I can't even play Minesweeper while I podcast. So
yeah, tic-tac-toe.
Yeah, I could do that. Real low tech. Tic-tac-toe could work. Maybe I could bet the house on online poker on my phone while doing an episode. But the paper's not really actually going to make that much difference. To be honest, it's stupid. But the thing I like having with the laptop in this situation is, as I'm talking, if I ever need to, I can go up to the spotlight in the top right-hand corner of the Apple operating system and look up a word in the dictionary if I want to double-check something.
Okay.
And so maybe that's an embarrassing admission, but I like having that handy, especially if it's kind of an archaic word and, I'm not 100% sure about some connotation or whatever. So,
well, I've got an 85-pound, Oxford dictionary. It's illustrated.
Oh, nice.
I could slap that up on the desk for you so you can, periodically kind of just flip through so people will hear that.
Well, we'll see. Yeah, if it comes to that, I'll ask for that. You all don't know what Eric has to do sometimes in order to produce the sort of seamless flow. Not even 90 seconds ago, I just had a terrible coughing fit, actually, which he's going to have to edit out. And so if I have to refer to the dictionary, I can do that, and he can just make it so that it never happened. But I did want to ask you, Eric, you have been really getting the most out of your library card for the last year or so. You've been on a kind of quite serious in a way that puts many an undergrad to shame, quest to kind of read a bunch of great works of fiction. And so
Yes.
I think your focus has mostly been on 19th century novels, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and you have torn through a bunch of these. And if listeners know anything about 19th century novels, and I know our listeners generally know a good bit, they tend to know that they're not short. I don't know what your page count has been over the last year, but it would be pretty impressive. But do you mind just running through a few of the things you've crossed off the list?
So I don't know what really kicked off this for me, but I think it was my wife in one of their book clubs.
Mm-hmm.
They read Dracula.
Yeah, my wife, I think, is in a different chapter of the same,
book club, right?
And
right.
she was, I'll admit, I've never read Dracula because that's, I've never been interested in horror movies or anything. And I knew Dracula was a substantial work, but it had just never been of interest to me.
Yeah.
And she was saying it was absolutely tremendous.
Yeah. And there were just some things going on that I was like, I wanted to see how, I don't know what got me to that, but it started with Dracula.
That was the first domino.
Yeah. It's not like, I've read a lot, but I probably go through periods where I'm not doing much reading at all. So I started with Dracula, Crime and Punishment, Moby Dick, went to the Brothers Karamazov, The Idiot.
Dickens, right?
Dickens, yes. Yeah, I did David Copperfield.
Yeah.
Which
that's
I knew,
a perfect novel, in my opinion.
It is. And I knew nothing about it.
Yeah.
Which I like. I like going into these without, like when I would just kind of look up, authors. I've read other things by Dickens, but I had no idea anything about it. And it just made it that much better.
Yeah.
Oh, I got Count of Monte Cristo.
See, and again, most of you probably know, but of all of these books are weighty. Count of Monte Cristo is 12 or 1,300 pages long. It's a real workout. I read that about 7.5 years ago, around the time that my first child was born. And I read a lot of it late at night when it was my turn to cover the night shift. But it's massive.
It is.
It's great. Like, it's an absolute swashbuckler. And it doesn't have the sort of terrible, frenetic intensity of Dostoevsky or anything like that, which, as long as his novels are, that's hard to sustain. But it is an amazing thing. So of those, you've listed some of the greatest novels ever written. You've listed some of my favorite novels ever written. What are one or two that are favorites?
And I go back to Dracula.
Okay.
As one of like the high marks, just because of how, it's written through letters and journals, and for it to be able to kind of flow as a narrative, and just, it's artfully done. I think it just made it became kind of just built in and part of the story. It was been just kind of the themes of the whole book. I really enjoyed that one. I've never read anything by Dostoevsky.
Well, you can't say that anymore.
No, but I loved particularly like Brothers Karamazov.
Yeah.
It's like he totally captures these people, these characters. You can totally see them. They're just like, we all know some loudmouth guy who just is a fool, and he knows he's a fool, and he's playing the fool.
Yep.
because, well, that's what everybody expects of me. But it's just, I think his
and then
characters
then I don't know which character specifically you're talking about, but I know the flavor. Then that fool will all of a sudden say something that's like disturbingly lucid,
right?
But then he'll undercut it and throw it away or something like the essence of Dostoevsky. It's like no other writer I've ever encountered. His novels are built around these enormous strings of 20-page conversations.
Yeah.
Where, he'll establish the scene and then two people will be talking and their temperatures will start rising and things are getting more and more. And then something is said that can't be unsaid. And then the person you thought was in the right keeps talking to the point where you realize, oh, they've been posing the whole time. And then a third person intervenes and they knock your sense of things. They knock it flying once again. And they just, the intensity of these conversations is, it's almost hard to handle. And yet it works so well.
Yeah.
And by the end of the book, you're kind of exhausted.
Well, yeah.
And you just think, man, it must be tough to be a Russian.
Yeah. Well, and especially you kind of get the flavor of what's going on in 19th century Russia.
Yeah.
And, we have, a hindsight of knowing like what it was leading to.
Yeah.
And just
he was so
problems.
prophetic.
And you kind of just see this and you're like, wow. He's become one of my favorite. So,
yeah.
So I also did Flannery O'Connor.
Sure.
Wise Blood.
Okay.
And a couple of other, I think I started a short story book like that. You recommended Bleak House, which I think I started, but I was like, it was right after David Copperfield.
Okay.
And I was like, I think I need to go back to 19th century Russia for some reason. I'm really feeling I really need 19th century Russia.
Yeah.
Because like in the Dickens novel, you see, I mean, it's like, yeah, sure, conditions aren't great, but
England was such an optimistic society in the 19th century, and they, like social problems were being solved, and and Russia,
Russia, but you get like, I don't know, I in my imagination's eye, I can see these middle class families who are considered, gentry folk, but you can just see that their clothes are nice, but they're not quite.
They're hanging on by their fingers.
Yeah. It's so fascinating. Anyway, so I've got a lot of recommendations for David.
Yeah.
I've been bugging him.
That's good. Well, Dickens, we have to do before too long. A couple of, I think for, when it comes to recommendations for you, I said that at some point now you've basically made your own bed. You're going to have to read War and Peace.
Yeah.
Or Anna Karenina, but, War and Peace is, well, what can I say? It's only a few years since I read it, and it blew me away.
Okay.
It's, you need to give it 300 or 400 pages because he has these 4 or 5 different noble families, and he gradually starts weaving the stories together.
Okay.
And the title is really serious. Like you start in more or less relative peacetime in these great palaces in St. Petersburg and Moscow, where it's the kind of behind the scenes finagling of families and romance plots. And then Napoleon starts making noise in Central Europe, and then you're at war. And, you're at war for 250 pages, and then you're back at a lull, and these characters, after some years have passed, and some of them are battle scarred or getting to know one another once again.
Right.
And then it's the invasion of Russia. But the Lawrence of Arabia's got nothing on it for this, astonishing sweeping scope. I think it'll be interesting to hear where you kind of end up slotting that. And then, like I say, I've never read Dracula, but I think before too long you'll have to read Frankenstein if you haven't yet.
I read it.
Oh, okay.
But it was in high school.
Okay, yeah.
So but that is on my list. I need to go back and do that one. Challenge accepted on War and Peace. I will.
When the time is right.
When the time is right. And
when you feel it.
Sometimes you just feel it, but Anna Karenina has come up. I was looking at that. So there's just so many.
These are books you buy knowing that you're just going to live with them for a couple of years until the time is ripe and it feels like it's now the War and Peace moment.
Okay.
Frankenstein's 200 or 300 pages, so you can and it's
nothing.
Yeah, that'd be a great, I don't think I'd have to turn many cartwheels to think of passages that would work for a Frankenstein episode. So we've got to do Dickens, we've got to do that.
Yeah.
We've only ever done English language stuff. I guess with Beowulf, we were working with a translation, but it's a translation of Old English. But it would be kind of cool to do the Russians at some point, although there's so many people who'd be more authoritative than me on them. But
but
that could be worth it. That would be good for some fun.
It would be, yeah. The top of my list for you is to do Dostoevsky.
Okay.
Crime and Punishment or Brothers Karamazov. I mean, those are...
Well, of the big four novels at the end of his life, I've never read The Idiot, which I've wanted for a long time, and the only one you need to read now, which I finished a year and a half ago or something, but is Demons, which is the one, I think that's the second last novel he wrote before the Brothers Karamazov, and it is absolutely stunning.
Yeah.
And if you're interested in Dostoevsky's kind of prophetic sense of what might be coming in Russia, that's the one, because it's about this revolutionary sect that's living kind of a sleeper cell underground style in this provincial town, and the poisonous ideologies that convince these people that they can do whatever they want and should. But so we'll compare notes on that when I finish The Idiot and you finish that.
Well, I've got good news for you. I already did that one.
Oh, really?
Just recently.
Oh, wow. Okay, so this has only been in the last month or two.
Yes.
Okay, so you've got all. So
I knocked.
There's great Dostoevsky before all that, The Gambler, Notes from Underground, but you've done the four monumental.
Yes.
Any one of those novels would have been enough to cement his reputation as a great novelist.
Yeah.
But
I was sold.
You've done all four of them.
Yeah, because I guess Crime and Punishment was the one I started with, and I was like, okay, this speaks to me. I mean, just like it was really eye opening. So, even the tech guy here at Professing Literature, is diving into literature. So if I can do it, so can anybody else.
Thousands of people attended Dostoevsky's funeral, and it wasn't all Bellatriste eggheads and things like that. It was regular Russians who often, I think, read his novels in serial as they were published, a couple of thousand words at a time. But,
interesting.
These things are not for highbrow types mostly. Some of the literature we've maybe looked at, Philip Sidney, who we did last time, is kind of within the context of Elizabethan literature. He's writing for an elite audience, although that in his case has more to do with sort of class and status than it does with intellectual elitism, although Sidney was intellectually elite. But most of it, certainly Shakespeare, certainly someone like, I'm just thinking, Orwell, Jane Eyre, it's for regular people.
Yeah.
And, our era has this embarrassment of information and of opportunity, and yet regular people are more put off than they were 100 years ago from the idea that these books are for them. And it's kind of a cheat that a person like me gets to build a career out of enjoying and then talking about this sort of stuff, because it's not, maybe Hegel or Scaliger or Heraclitus or something like that is for a true highbrow, but literature is not. And, it demands the best from us intellectually if it's good. It also, to a great extent, meets us where we are. And these things survive partly because they are compulsively readable.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, if you're talking about something like Elizabethan poetry, then there is a certain, you have to put some work in to just sort of tune your frequency so that the sentence structures and poetic styles and things like that make sense to you. But with 19th century fiction, there's not too much of that that's necessary before you can get swept up in it.
Yeah. And even like language styles, they're totally accessible to, people that may think of themselves as like, well, I can't read these paragraph long sentences. It's just like, no, you don't give yourself enough credit.
Yeah. Put your phone on the other side of the room and force yourself to focus, and you'll be okay. And that's true of even something like Moby Dick has this very particular voice in the character of Ishmael.
Mm-hmm.
He's a weirdo. And then the story he's telling is strange, and it's partly strange because it involves so much esoterica about the sea and about whaling and about whales. And then because, if you don't know the book, Moby Dick is famous for whole chapter-long pauses where it just talks about the habits of whales or the mythologies surrounding whales or the digestive tract of whales.
Right.
And so that one's compared to some 19th century. And also I think there's a sense of a kind of Northeastern American kind of style of speaking that isn't exactly like 21st century Oklahoma, but it's not that hard.
Right.
You can, and maybe once in a while you look at a footnote or something like that and get clarification, but you don't, people are unfortunately intimidated by this stuff. And if you're an English professor, I think a lot of jobs have this kind of aspect to them. But if you're an if you're a dentist, someone who meets you in line at a coffee place and asks what you do for a living, I think they start apologizing about how they haven't been to the dentist in 2 years.
Right.
If you're an English professor and someone finds out, they'll be like, oh man, okay. I read Hamlet in high school and I didn't understand it, and I've always wanted to go back to it and read more Shakespeare. And it's like, it's okay. You don't owe me any explanations, but also you can do it if you want to.
Right.
Like there's a little bit of a learning curve where in order to get comfortable with it, you've got to put some time in, but then, it's not that very much time. It's not very much time, I think. Like I see this with undergrads all the time. You don't have to put that much time in before you start getting enough of it to really appreciate it. And then without even noticing it, you're getting the lion's share of it. And
well, I see that totally in just doing the podcast with you, particularly in poetry, because, when I read some poems, there's poems in the past that I've read that I've really loved. But then others, again, because like you said, my frequency isn't tuned, but the episodes that you've done on poetry have just been like mind blowing. Like, wow, there's so much packed into this.
Yeah.
And I've come more to, and just that poetry matters.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's music to my ears. It's also a good segue.
Thank you.
For us to get, you set that ball and I'll do my best to spike it over the net now. That's a good segue, and we'll get down to some business. And I hope I can give Eric yet more cause to think that this stuff is worth it. I don't think he needs my salesmanship at this point, but let's keep the streak going. So I don't know if you can exactly call this the second of a 2-part episode, but it kind of in my mind is. I'd thought about doing an episode on sort of courtly love poetry and Sidney. And if you were with us last time, you will recall what we said about Sir Philip Sidney as this exponent of sort of the dominant tradition within Elizabethan love poetry. And now we're looking at another great exemplar of Elizabethan love poetry. He's kind of, to be technical, Elizabethan / Jacobean, because he begins his career as a poet in the last decade of Elizabeth I's life. He then continues to write poetry after she dies for another 20-ish years. And so he's both, we would say, that's during the reign of James I, James Stuart. So we would say he's Elizabethan and Jacobean. But anyway, I'm being overly technical. Sidney, as an exponent of this dominant tradition of courtly love poetry in the form of the sonnet. And so I'll refer you to that episode. It had to do with idealization, sort of hyper-idealization of the beloved within this very strict, formal, poetic style, the sonnet, with these very strict conventions that he's playing with. And it's not that Sidney can't be subversive, but when he is, he's sort of, if this makes sense, he's subversive at the edges of this tradition and at this structure. And with today's poet, we're dealing with someone altogether different. John Donne is our subject today, and John Donne is category breaking. He is in his love poetry and also in his religious poetry, to which we will, I think, devote future episodes. He's fresh, unexpected, scandalous, and disturbingly honest. He's also one of my favorite people in all of literary history. And if I was asked to do one of those, who would you invite to your all-time ultimate dinner party? I never really liked that game anyway. This will seem quite lame, Eric, but it just kind of bothers me. I think, do I really want to call C.S. Lewis and Winston Churchill and Edmund Burke from the grave and force them to sit at my dinner table and have all of us try and make conversation? So that sort of always makes me wince when I'm asked that question. It's like, what does Julius Caesar have to say to the Duke of Wellington? Other than they're both really annoyed at me for making them sit there and eat chicken tikka masala and try to make conversation. But if I had to put that list together, John Donne would be on it. I love John Donne as a writer, and I love his soul. He's brilliant. He's intense. He's restless. He's self-critical. He's warm-hearted. He had a very painful life. He had some things on his conscience that he was ashamed of, but he was a good man. He was born in 1572 in London. He was born to a Roman Catholic family at an awkward time to be Roman Catholic in England after the Elizabethan Reformation had been underway for the better part of a generation. His family, because of their Catholicism, were under scrutiny from the government, and doors were closed to Donne because he was a Catholic in that era. So he eventually converted to the Protestant Church of England when he was in his 20s for a mixed bag of reasons. Some of them were kind of sympathetic. At that point, he was not a convinced and convicted Protestant. He was running away from certain things in his own family history and in the Catholicism, which he did not like. And he was running towards careerism because he was brilliant and he didn't want his life to be circumscribed because of a religion he wasn't sure about. It was only after years that he became sort of at home in the Church of England and sort of rediscovered his faith. He got himself a very promising career because of this conversion to the National Church. And then after only a few years, and we're around about the turn of the 17th century, he threw it all away for love. Donne had been a womanizer. He'd been a swaggering, fashionable young gallant with this great career, and he seemed to have climbed through many a bedroom window in that time. But he fell in love with the 17-year-old niece of his employer, Sir Thomas Egerton, and they married in secret, and when her father found out, they were in big trouble. Donne was thrown into prison for a couple of months because marrying a powerful man's daughter without his permission was not a good idea. And Anne More, whom Donne loved and married, and who loved him, had been destined for higher things by her father. Donne's status as a young man in a hurry who was probably going to make a brilliant career was one thing, but at that point in his life he had no money and a promising but uncertain foothold in the world, and so he was not good enough for this man's daughter, and he suffered. And so not only did he have to do a stint in prison of some weeks, it wasn't like years of hard labor, but I don't want to go to an Elizabethan prison, and you don't either. When he got out, all the doors that his conversion had opened were now closed to him because he had offended the wrong people. And so that meant years of living in semi-poverty, with a wife he truly loved and was devoted to, and who loved him. They had a child a year for 12 years, if you can imagine that. Only half of those children survived to adulthood, and every time there was another baby, there was another mouth to feed. And Donne, for years, just did not have enough money to make ends properly meet. But he wrote. He wrote often in a state of sickness and exhaustion and uncertainty, trying to find preferment, doing some small jobs in the world of sort of private secretaryship or small-scale diplomacy, but never able to gain a kind of foothold in the sort of regular income that would give them breathing room. After hard years, Anne died following the stillbirth of their 12th child. And around about that time, Donne finally decided to take orders in the Church of England. This is something that friends had suggested to him at different times over the previous years. And the King of England, who admired Donne as a writer, James I, had said he would give John Donne great promotion, but only if he became a churchman, because the king thought Donne, and the king was not the only one, that Donne would make a great priest. He was right. Donne pushed against this for some time, partly because he wasn't sure that he was called to it, and partly because he did not want it to be said that he did so because of the money. You know, he knew that people would say that if he finally accepted or took holy orders and then received somewhat comfortable situations within the church. He knew people would accuse him of having bad motives. But eventually he decided to do it, and within a few years he'd become the most famous and celebrated preacher in early Stuart England, in an era where people would listen to preachers preach for 1 or 2 hours at a time. He continued to write poetry sporadically. In the first decade of his career, his subject had almost entirely, not quite, but almost entirely been devoted to love. And in the second half of his career, the focus, well, I suppose it remained love, but the focus was on God rather than a woman. But we're looking at Donne as a love poet. As a love poet, as a young man, Donne was very much aware of the dominant trends within Elizabethan love poetry, and he was completely indifferent to them. I don't know if he scorned them exactly, maybe sometimes, but they were not representative of the kind of poetry he was going to write. The kind of poetry he was going to write was like nobody else's. In his lifetime, he was respected by other poets, sometimes highly, sometimes only moderately. He was not adored the way, say, the young Wordsworth was. He was respected. It was only really in the early 20th century that, Donne's reputation really started to climb as figures like T.S. Eliot began to see greatness, not just interesting things in Donne, but greatness in him. His poetry is not easy. It is complex, thorny, and can even be jangly on the ear. Once in a while, he can write a line or a stanza that is smooth and mellifluous in the way that we expect lyric poets to be. But often his language is grinding and jolting. It's almost as though his ideas were too ungainly and complicated to fit into regular, harmonious consonant patterns, and he doesn't really want them to. I mentioned T.S. Eliot in the early 20th century. Maybe the figure who really, 100 years before that, turned around people's estimation of Donne, and it took a while to do it fully. But the first major figure who really, after the 17th century, recognized Donne in some ways for what he was Samuel Taylor Coleridge in the early 19th century. Coleridge, like many another poet, would sometimes write epigrams, short sort of poetic aphorisms or something like that, summing up an idea or a thing or another writer in a couple of lines of verse. The idea with Coleridge's epigrams is that, and he's probably just at first doodling them in the margin of another page he's writing something else about, but It's, can you express in a couple of exquisitely crafted lines the essence of something as you see it? And so Coleridge left us an epigram on John Donne, and it goes like this. With Donne, whose muse on dromedary trots, wreathe iron pokers into true love knots. Rhyme's sturdy cripple, fancy's maze and clue, wit's forge and fire blast, meaning's press and screw. It's just a brilliant 4-line summing up of Donne's style and Donne's character. So if I can go over it briefly, Coleridge says that Donne's muse trots on a dromedary. A dromedary, of course, is a camel. For those of you who are keeping score, the dromedary is the one-hump camel of northern Africa, as opposed to two-humper, the Bactrian camel of East and Central Asia, the camel of the Silk Routes and the Gobi Deserts. The dromedary is sort of Near East into Middle East and North Africa. It's the one-hump camel. But Donne's muse trots on a dromedary, which is hilarious. A muse is supposed to fly on its own wings, or maybe, hitch a ride on Pegasus or something like that. But if you can picture a camel, first of all, they're horribly ugly as mammals go, and then their gait is jolting and sort of rough and bouncy. It's not like a great horse that can canter smoothly. A camel moves awkwardly, and that's how Donne's muse moves. And what does Donne do? Coleridge says he wreathes iron pokers into true love knots. So a love knot, something, think of a lock of a woman's hair with a little bit of ribbon tied to it or something like that. Donne's love knot is made out of an iron poker. But Coleridge says it's a true love knot. It's just made of this unexpected material. He is rhyme's sturdy cripple, so Coleridge is appreciating the fact that Donne's verse can be awkward. And he is the press and screw, so, think of a vice or something like that of meaning. So if meaning is there before Donne, what he does is he puts it in his vice, attached to his workbench, and he twirls the vice handle until it smushes the meaning and gets everything out of it. So this imagery is, Coleridge's imagery. It's a little bit violent. It's a little bit rough. These are the things he associates with Donne, but that he's drawing something rich and true out of these ideas as he's sort of tormenting these ideas within his poetry. I've always loved that as a summing up of who Donne is. Donne is often considered to be the greatest of the so-called metaphysical poets, although there are contenders, George Herbert, Andrew Marvell, for that title. This is a group of 17th century writers. It's a later designation, sort of collection term for them, of writers who have some similar themes and approaches, characterized by sort of sensuous language. And I won't get into what T.S. Eliot said on this subject, but, if you're interested in Donne, Eliot's essays on him are worth looking at. Donne especially, often many of these poets who we think of as metaphysicals, Marvell, Henry Vaughan, Richard Crashaw, write deliberate, complicated verse forms with very elaborate rhyme schemes sometimes. And so this offended later writers who liked sort of classical consistency and simplicity. The thing Donne is maybe most famous for, and I hope to illustrate it today, is creativity with metaphor. His metaphors can be shockingly original. And that's harder to do than one would think. And you'll sometimes see attached to Donne and writers of this school, loosely speaking, the term metaphysical conceit. Conceit meaning the sort of device. And so the metaphysical conceit is the habit, as it's been described in writers like Donne, of linking together two unlikely things. And so think of how this works with metaphor or simile. Metaphor and simile are figurative language, so you're using one thing to describe another. The most famous of them all, we talked about this with Sidney last time, comparing blonde hair to gold. So, her golden hair or the golden wreath about her head or something like that. That's being metaphorical when you're doing that. You're comparing a woman's hair, which is yellow, to a precious metal, which is yellow. And so when you're doing that, you have the yellowness in common, so it's straightforward enough. And you also got the additional complement of gold being precious, and so the woman's hair being something precious. So if you look at that, the what we'd call within that metaphor, the tenor and the vehicle are very close together, and they're very naturally suited to one another. With a metaphor, or the tenor and the vehicle, with a metaphor, the tenor is the thing you're trying to describe, and the vehicle is the way in which you describe it. So you're trying to describe the yellow hair, and you're doing it through the language of gold. And so the tenor and the vehicle are quite close together there because, like I said, blonde hair is yellow as gold is, and gold is precious, and that's what you're trying to say about the hair. With Donne, it's almost as though he tries to pull the tenor and the vehicle as far apart as he can and choose a metaphorical association for the thing, the tenor that he's trying to describe that is almost absurd. And the reason he does this is because we pay attention when he does it. Or at least if we're paying attention, we're forced to focus and give it more attention. Because I don't know about you, but if I read something about how her hair was like gold or her lips were like rubies, I'm maybe not paying that much attention because it almost goes without saying, and it's a stock metaphor. But with Donne's metaphors, we can't afford to do that because they are weird. And so we'll see some examples of that in the poem we're going to talk about. Donne is original in his style and approach as a poet. As a love poet, he's also extremely distinctive in this era. Sidney is writing, as I said, within the fashion of the day, and he's challenging it, and he's trying to become the great exponent of that fashion of Petrarchan love poetry. It's his own attempt to reach or aspire to perfection within that tradition. And so not only is he writing Petrarchan sonnets, but he's writing them about a woman that he's in love with. He's regarding the woman through the sort of stock approach that the tradition demands. In other words, you idealize her and put her on a pedestal. And Sidney writes with these stock superlatives that were inherited from the Italians, that the woman's beauty is according to what we call the blason of, or blazon of the Petrarchan love tradition. So she has blonde hair, she has blue eyes, she has creamy complexion with pink cheeks because she's modest and can be made to blush. She's not worldly and battle-hardened. She is also, in addition to her physical excellence, she's also always virtuous, wise, noble, in the sense of both character and social rank. Last time I said when we were talking about this with Sidney that you can't love someone on a pedestal. And Sidney's poetry is kind of aware of this and plays with it. But Donne takes it for granted, and he doesn't put women on pedestals. Whether he's talking about his wife a little bit later in his career, or whether he's talking about the woman whose name he maybe has trouble remembering, whom he's only been with for a night, he doesn't put her on a pedestal. Sometimes in his love poetry, Donne can, he does have poems which seem to have been written a little bit later in his career to his wife, or for his wife. But even when he's at earlier phases in his career and he's writing about just various women who've crossed his path and whom he's dallied with, he gives us a sense of her as a real person, even if he's being nasty to her, because sometimes he's not being nasty to her. Sometimes he's being energetic and he's pressing very hard to convince her to give him a try. Sometimes he's talking rapturously about how perfect they are for one another. Sometimes he's insecure because he's worried that she'll leave him. Sometimes he's angry at her. Sometimes he's very bitter because she has already left him and he's excoriating towards her. But there is always the sense of a conversation with a real woman, and sometimes there's real immediacy in Donne's poetry. I think we see this in the poem that I led the episode off with, of a real moment in time. In that case, the moment in time when two people realize they are in love and that the world is different. And there's a sense of love as a kind of sacred power, even if Donne is writing somewhat blasphemously about it in the relationship. There is a sense of two people plugging into a nuclear reactor. They are in the presence of something super powerful, which is love, and which destroys conventions and burns up typical associations. The two poems we're looking at today, The Good Morrow, which we'll look at briefly in a little while, and the other one we'll focus on, are about what you could broadly call healthy, happy moments in relationships. But Donne's, as I said, Donne's poems aren't always that way. But always there is a struggle with the real quandaries of a particular human being and real interaction. And it comes across as being from inside the relationship, not across a distance. The goal for Donne, whether he's writing about God or whether he's writing about a woman, is intimacy. That is the word that always comes up when I think about Donne as a poet. It's intimacy. He suggests a genuine moment. He gives us poetry that tends usually to be in the present rather than looking back nostalgically or anything like that. And the idea is that the poet is yearning not just for sex, although sometimes that can be foregrounded. Sometimes in poems like The Flea, it can be quite provocatively and cheekily foregrounded, or in Elegy 19 on his mistress going to bed. So there's sometimes the desire for the physical is intense, but even then, there's a sense that what the poet takes for granted is the idea that two are supposed to become one, in terms of their souls and minds, not just their bodies. That's partly why his betrayal poems are so toxic, because while Donne in his younger days might have been a womanizer, he was that sort of womanizer who falls in love every time. And every time it doesn't work out, he gets his heart broken, and he's maybe getting jaded also, but it's genuine. He desires intensity of connection. We saw that in The Good Morrow. I'll talk a little bit about The Good Morrow now. This is probably one of his earliest love poems. So this is not about his wife or future wife. This is about a woman we don't know. It's maybe about a composite of several women, but it captures the moment when two people realize that they're in love. The idea of the good morrow, and you may have gotten this sense as I was reading it, is that the two people, or at least as the speaker is figuring it, the two people are aware that reality has been changed because of their love. So it's not just this is fun, we should keep it going. It's not just that this is fun, so why not make it permanent and sign the papers? It's that this is reality altering. And so he begins by asking, what did we do before we loved? We were just children. We sucked on country pleasures. We were just children. But now that we've found each other, we are grown up. And he cites this old legend of the Christian church of the so-called seven sleepers, these children who were put to sleep by God in a cave during the Decian persecutions in the 3rd century in the Roman Empire, when Christians were being horribly persecuted by the empire. And the legend says, as their fellow Christians were being martyred every day and thrown to the lions or burned to death, they were put to sleep by God in a cave, and they woke up years later after the Constantinian Revolution had made Christianity first legalized and then favored, and then the dominant and then the exclusive religion of the Roman Empire. So they go to sleep in this sort of nightmarish time of persecution, and then by God's grace, they wake up in this other blessed reality. And he says that's like it was for us, that before that, all pleasures fancies be. Before that, we were just kidding ourselves, like children who think that Bubblicious and a box of Milk Duds represents the highest that taste can aspire to. But now we see the real thing. And so good morrow, good morning to our waking souls. Our souls have awaked. It's so different, he says, because our souls watch not one another out of fear. As so many lovers, I think, do, where there's apprehension and nervousness and self-consciousness and a sense that they might stop loving me before I stop loving them. Donne says, no, we're different now. We're at peace with one another. And love has made a new reality. Love makes one little room and everywhere in that wonderful line. And so the fullness of reality is between us. Let explorers go to all the corners of the globe. We have the truth of reality here. That's an idea that recurs so often in Donne's positive love poems, The Canonization, The Sun Rising, and many others. In the third stanza, he gives this wonderful image, which, in 3, 4, 5 poems he returns to. Donne always returns to ideas that he really likes and reincorporates them into new poems. But this is wonderful. My face in thine eye, thine in mine appears, and true plain hearts do in the faces rest. So what's he saying? Well, imagine you're looking at someone and the light is just right, and you're looking in their eyes steadily, which is something that you can only do in a moment of genuine intimacy. To look deeply into someone else's eyes. What do you see? You see the little reflection of yourself in there. Donne likes imagining what that means spiritually, that we are sort of visible in one another's eyes. It means that there's proximity. It means that there's intimacy, there's trust. Because all of those things are necessary in order to look that deeply into someone else's eyes. But it suggests that each of us are sort of ensouled in one another. And that can't get any better than that, he says. And he ends that poem by talking about how the two of us have attained this perfect balance of communion and sort of mutual indwelling. That means, he suggests, we may never die. We've arrived at this sort of perfect alchemical point of balance between the two of us, where we might just as well look into one another's eyes for all eternity. To be in love is maybe to feel at least some version of this, but Donne captures it exquisitely. And this, of course, is far from the project of Philip Sidney. It's not that Philip Sidney fails to capture this, but that's not what he's doing. He's giving us this image of the sort of ardent but also self-indulgent young man of fashion who gets thunderstruck by the sight of a woman and obsesses about her. And that's interesting enough in itself, and there's plenty of truth in Sidney's poetry. But Donne can't be bothered to play what by the 1590s had become kind of, he must have thought, the tired game of courtly love poetry. He wanted something so much more vigorous, something with some dirt under its fingernails, because there's a sense of real life oftentimes in his poetry, but the sense of real life and sort of the coarseness of real life is balanced by this idealization of perfect union. Astrophil wouldn't know what to do if he got half an hour alone with Stella, but Donne knows what to do. What do? You look into her eyes and you talk and you become close. And yes, you'll probably lose some clothes along the way, and that side of it will be brought out as well, but that's never only what he wants. So let's look at our principal poem now, having talked a little bit about the good morrow. This is just a wonderful, wonderful poem. This is a later stage in Donne's career as love poet. It's got to be one of the last love poems, properly speaking, he wrote, because already at this point, we're maybe in the year 1611, 1612, when he's been a married man for more than a decade. And as I said, life has not been easy with his wife, although they seem to have been genuinely devoted to one another in some pretty difficult circumstances. But we're looking now at a poem called A Valediction Forbidding Mourning, a valediction : forbidding mourning. And mourning is spelled mourning, so not morning meaning the sunrise, but mourning meaning ritualized grief. Donne wrote a number of poems that are valedictions, where that word appears in the title. There's the valediction of My Name in the Window. There are a few others. A valediction is a farewell. Valedictory, the valedictorian is the one who says farewell. And so his valedictions are different kinds of goodbyes that he wrote, sporadically across his career. He didn't write a batch of them all at once, but once in a while a certain situation would occur to him poetically, and he would capture it in one of his valedictions, one of his farewell sayings. This is the favorite and most beloved of his valediction poems. The valediction forbidding mourning, so forbidding someone from grieving. So keep that in mind as I talk about it. I'm shuffling those papers I mentioned. This is written, as I say, about 1611. It seems to have been written at a time when Donne, in order to make some money and hopefully climb a rung or two on the ladder in his stalled career, was traveling to the continent as part of a diplomatic embassy. So he was going to be in continental Europe for some months. And so he was going to be leaving his wife. She's probably pregnant at this time. That was not unusual for Anne Donne. But I've read a couple of things that suggest that they can frame when this probably was written or the moment it probably refers to. So she would have been pregnant. And there's a sense of a concrete situation, as there so often is in Donne's poetry. In other words, he's capturing a specific moment in this relationship. He is got his bags packed on the doorstep, and he's saying goodbye to her. So it's the John Denver moment, leaving on a jet plane. He loves this woman. She's upset because he's going. He's probably upset also that he's going. And so he's trying to find something to say to her that will comfort her and that will stop that kind of moment of grief that we worry about, probably for her sake as well as for his, where she'll have a breakdown on the sidewalk and maybe he'll have a breakdown also. So the bags are packed. They're being loaded onto the wagon. He's got to get down to the wharf to find his berth on the ship. He doesn't have much time. They've put off the moment of goodbye for as long as they could. But here it is, and so we have the valediction forbidding mourning, telling her not to be sad, or not to be so sad at his leaving. Many a poet might take up this subject, but none would take it up in the way John Donne does. So I'll read the poem, which is addressed. You have to imagine the poet is on the sidewalk, that they're saying their final goodbyes, and so he's speaking to this woman. And here's what he has to say: a valediction forbidding mourning. As virtuous men pass mildly away and whisper to their souls to go, whilst some of their sad friends do say, the breath goes now, and some say no, so let us melt and make no noise. No tear floods nor sigh tempests move. 'Twere profanation of our joys to tell the laity of our love. Moving of the earth brings harms and fears, men reckon what it did and meant, but trepidation of the spheres, though greater far, is innocent. Dull sublunary lover's love, whose soul is sense, cannot admit absence, because it doth remove the thing which elemented it. But we, by a love so much refined that ourselves know not what it is, inter-assured of the mind, care less eyes, lips, and hands to miss. Our two souls, therefore, which are one, though I must go, endure not yet a breach, but an expansion, like gold to airy thinness beat. If they be two, they are two so as stiff twin compasses are two. Thy soul, the fixed foot, makes no show to move, but doth if th' other do. And though it in the centre sit, yet when the other far doth roam, it leans and hearkens after it, and grows erect as that comes home. Such wilt thou be to me, who must like th' other foot obliquely run. Thy firmness makes my circle just, and makes me end where I begun. I hope you had a sense of the beauty of this poem, because there is great beauty in it, although it is a difficult poem, not just in the sense that it's 16th century English, but that it's John Donne's 16th century English, and he never makes it easy on us. He is pressing that meaning out of the screw, the press and screw, as Coleridge described. And so let's begin and work our way through it, going from top to bottom, and see what we come to in the Valediction, forbidding mourning. Notice, I talked about the metaphysical conceit and the idea that Donne has the habit of making metaphors or similes out of unexpected things that don't fit well together, as though someone was comparing, their school days to, I don't know, a rubber duck or something like that, like just a weird, bizarre metaphor. That's what he does, and we get one of these at the very beginning of the poem. It's kind of great. Imagine him saying, "Sweetheart, baby, it's going to be a few months, and I'm going to miss you, but it's okay. It's just like our situation, it's okay, because it's just like when a good man dies." That's what he says at the beginning of the poem as he's attempting to comfort her. He says, "As virtuous men pass mildly away, how proverbially is a good man to die? Well, a good man might get shot down in battle like Philip Sidney. But, generally speaking, if we imagine a good man dying of illness while he's still conscious or, only beginning to lose consciousness, a good man who has a clean conscience and is at peace with himself can let his soul go easily enough. And so it would just slip away. Rather than a bad man who's lashed with guilt and is uneasy in his mind, who might be fighting death, a good man might not want death, but he can accept it. And so he can just, as Donne says, whisper to his soul to go, and it goes, so that some of the people around the bedside think, I think he's passed away, and others say, no, not yet. I thought I saw his chest rise. He's not dead quite yet. They're not sure. And so from this unexpected beginning, the death of a good man, Donne is going to try to make a poem of comfort for his wife on the doorstep. So he says, having taken 4 lines to establish this idea of a good man dying so peacefully that we might not even be sure that he's died, he says, "So let us melt and make no noise." So we won't fall apart here and collapse on one another and howl. Why won't we do that? Well, it's going to be, he explains in what follows, because of the quality of our love, because our love is of such a pureness that we don't need to do that. There's something strategic about this poem, although I think it's strategic for purposes of generosity. We have the sense that he's trying to keep this woman from breaking down and crying, maybe because he doesn't want to do the same himself, maybe because it's a little bit embarrassing for both of them if they do that, but also because he doesn't want her to be sort of emotionally ripped apart by this moment. He wants to comfort her and make her peaceful as best he can. And so, having established the idea of the good man who dies so gently that it's hardly can be noticed, he has a payoff word at the beginning of the 5th line, the 2nd stanza. "So let us melt and make no noise." So we will just slip apart without any kind of outward sign of it, or like disturbing sign of it. And we don't need to be moved, and these are tropes that Donne loves, by tear floods or sigh tempests. The sigh, the wind blowing like a storm, he often talks about that, or tears as a flood. We don't need that. Why not? Well, he says it's not just that it'd be unpleasant for us to weep in that exaggerated or loud and despairing way. It is, he says, a profanation of our joy to tell the laity of our love. All the time, it's a commonplace about Donne. All the time in his love poetry, he's using religious language, and in his divine poetry, he's using the language of erotic love. Here he's doing the former. He says it would be a profanation of our joy to tell the laity of our love. It would be sacrilegious for other people to know. And so he suggests, what does he mean by laity? Well, the laity, the lay people, are those people in the church who do not have holy orders, who are not deacons, priests, or bishops, or, for Catholics, monks or friars or nuns. All of those people are the so-called, they're of the clergy in some way or another, or at least, they're capital R religious. The laity are regular congregants, Christian churchgoers. But Donne is here suggesting that we're in a religion of two. We're priests in a religion of two, the religion of love. And this moment is something that needs to be kept within the walls of the temple and shouldn't spill outside so that the congregants, the regular people, know of it. That would be a kind of sacrilege. This is too personal for them, so let us melt and make no noise. The most difficult stanza in the poem is the third, which follows, where he uses quite convoluted imagery to further make his point. He says, moving of the earth brings harms and fears. Men reckon what it did and meant. So moving of the earth, you could imagine an earthquake, although sometimes it's speculated that he's talking about the shift from a geocentric to a heliocentric solar system where the earth is now orbiting the sun. He might be talking about that. But either way, he's saying that movement of the earth is, I think it's simpler, at least, I don't know if it's truer, but it's simpler to imagine an earthquake. If the earth is quaking, we're looking around at each other, we're bracing ourselves, we're wondering what's up and how long it's going to last, and if anything falls, will fall down on top of us. An earthquake is a kind of violent thing that you can't help but notice. But he says trepidation of the spheres, disturbances among the stars, don't give us, there might be vast cosmic things. There might be stars being born within nebulae or vanishing out of existence, collapsing into black holes. Something far larger, if you can use 20th century astrophysics to help understand it. Something far larger and mightier is going on in the depths of space, but we don't feel it or notice it on Earth. So in other words, we're more like the trepidation of the spheres, that great galactic event that's happening light years away, that's far more extraordinary than the mere rubbing together of a couple of tectonic plates. But it's so far beyond the laity's conception that they don't notice it. They'd notice an earthquake, but we're not a little earthquake. We are these stars in this galaxy, or some such. And so we have no need to shake them. The fact that we're separating is more meaningful than they can comprehend. If that sounds vain, sure, it's vain, but it's within the context of trying to remind this person what we have is special and different. And so because it's so special and different, we don't need to carry on and fall apart and weep. He expands on this point in the following stanza, which I think it's sort of awkward, but it's very beautiful. He says, dull sublunary lover's love, whose soul is sense, cannot admit absence, because it doth remove the things which elemented it, those things which elemented it. Dull sublunary lover's love. What does sublunary mean? Sublunar, beneath the moon. So in the traditional Ptolemaic cosmology, the moon was understood to be the first of the cosmic spheres that surrounded the earth, growing ever larger and going outward, as though the earth were the bullseye and the target and the moon was the first ring around the bullseye. And going back to the ancients, it was understood that everything beneath the sphere of the moon was subject to chance and fortune and misfortune and chaos. Things die, things experience pain, there is randomness and disorder. That's life below the sphere of the moon. But to look up into the heavens is to see order, and the stars moving in their fixed patterns, and the planets moving predictably through those patterns. And so everything above the sphere of the moon is constant. And so other people are sublunar. It makes sense, he says, that when they go through change, it shakes them, and they break down and they cry. Of course they do, because they're made of the four elements, and they're subject to change and decay. So of course they weep, and they hold on to each other, and they say, I'm afraid I'm never going to see you again. You know, travel to the European continent in the early 17th century is no joke. That wooden ship of yours can go down as it's crossing the North Sea, or strange things can happen to your party as it's traveling across the Low Countries and into Germany. We can understand why she might be a little bit upset, but Donne says regular people weep and carry on. We don't need to do that. They can't admit absence because it means taking away the thing upon which their love is based, which is the physical presence of the other person. Beneath the sphere of the moon, reality was understood to be composed of the four elements. This is classical cosmology and also medieval Christian cosmology, the four elements of earth, air, water, and fire. Every physical thing is made up of some combination of those four elements, it is believed. Above the sphere of the moon, there are none of those four elements, not even fire. There is only ether, which is a different thing. It's not one of the four physical principles that we have beneath the sphere of the moon. And so regular people, dull sublunary lovers, of course, they are emotionally tremulous because their love is based on physical proximity. But what Donne will go on to explain in the second half of the poem is that our love is based on something transfinite, something beyond physical proximity. It is not elemented, it is not made up of the same stuff as these other people. He says, we by a love so much refined that ourselves know not what it is, so even it is a mystery even to us. Interassured of the mind, care less eyes, lips, and hands to miss. So of course those people, those poor slobs out there need to hold hands and kiss, and Donne likes doing these things. He talks about these things at great length in other poems. But right now he's in a specific situation and he's trying to perform a specific rhetorical task, namely bring comfort. And so he's saying, in this hyper-idealized way, we don't need that physical proximity. We can be indifferent comparatively to missing the touch and immediate sight of one another. Why? Because we are interassured of the mind. Because we have a depth of connection that is simply stronger than other people, and so we don't need to fret. Now, it's not that easy. I think Donne is serious about the idea that he and his wife have a profound depth of connection. That's not always going to make life easier. On a later trip to the continent, we read in Isaac Walton's Life of Donne, Donne writes about, and Walton picks it up, Donne writes about how when he was traveling with an embassy later in the continent, he was in his room one night, and once again he had left his pregnant wife at home. I think we're now about 1614. His wife dies a year or two later. I think she dies in 1616, although you can pull me up on that if it's 1615. He rushes into his boss's room one night, and he's white as a sheet, and he says he's just had a vision. He's just seen an apparition, and it is of his wife gliding through his room, holding a dead infant. It's horrible. And he believes he'd really seen her and that he's being sent a message. And he's dreadfully afraid that she's died, giving birth. His employer is a little bit skeptical, but supports him. And so Donne rushes home, which would not have been a small thing. It would have been an expensive thing. And he probably would have left some money sitting in Germany that he could no longer claim to have earned. But he rushes home to London. And he finds his wife is still alive, but I believe, if I'm recalling the story properly, their child had been stillborn. And indeed, a year or so later, she would, as I said, die, giving birth to their last child, who was also stillborn. So it was maybe a premonition of that or something like that. I bring this up. It's a kind of tragic, hard anecdote, although a very moving one. It does say something about the connection Donne imagined between him and his wife. And so it's no small thing being separated for a few months. And boy, oh boy, the idea of being separated from your wife for a few months when she is pregnant, even in the 21st century when we hear about a soldier or a sailor or something who has to do that, it's a solemn thing to think of leaving a pregnant wife for that length of time, even in the world of Skype and Zoom and FaceTime. But he is trying to tell her we are different. The physical body that is so necessary for other lovers isn't necessary for us. He goes on, another stunning stanza, another unexpected trope. The gold he's talking about here isn't being used to describe in a straightforward way hair, but the very fabric of their being. Our two souls, therefore, which are one, he said, though I must go, endure not yet a breach, but an expansion, like gold to airy thinness beat. So our souls are joined, seriously joined. They are now one soul. The Christian Bible or the Judeo-Christian scriptures talk about how marriage means two people becoming one flesh. Donne, at several points in his career, talks about how intimacy seems to make one soul of two people. And so he says our two souls are one. And so that means if I'm going away from you, it's not that there's a breach, as though there's space between us and we're cut off from one another. It's rather that we are just stretched. The goldsmiths of Elizabethan England were amazing at hammering out or twisting, drawing out gold until it was wire as fine as a woman's hair. But he says, imagine we are a piece of gold that has been beaten so flat and spread out so that it looks invisible. And yet it has not been broken, even though it can no longer be seen because it's been stretched so far. It is still one piece of gold. And so although I have to go, it's an expansion rather than a breach. And so we will still be connected. He says he throws that metaphor away, then wonderful it is, as it is in the next stanza. And he says, okay, if we are two different things, another metaphysical conceit, unexpected use of deployment of figurative language. He says, if we are two different things, if we're not just one piece of gold, I'll vary the metaphor. If we are two things, then we're two things in the way that a pair of compasses are two things. By compass here, he's not talking about a magnetic compass, which allows you to find due north. He's talking about the kind of compass you had in your geometry set at school that was used for drawing a circle, and we all remember those, right, of a certain generation. I don't know, I guess now you do it on your iPad in 5th grade, and it's a shame because I loved playing with my compass, even though it had the risk of drawing blood in 5th grade. You know, you'd screw the little pencil into one side of the compass and the other had a spike, and you'd stick the spike in the middle of a paper. And then you'd manipulate the compass around so that the pencil draws a perfect or near perfect circle on the middle of the paper. So a pair of compasses, which can be used to draw a circle. He says, if we're two in the way that is two. So in other words, you have two different things, you could say, the different legs of the compass, but they are joined by a hinge and screwed together at the top. So yes, they're two different things, but they're attached. And so he says, you are the fixed foot of the compass because you're not leaving. You're the point, if you like, of the compass that stabs into the paper and stays still. It swivels, but it doesn't move across or up and down or side to side on the paper. It stays in its point. I'm like the other end of the compass because I'm the moving one, so I'm like the pencil. And so he says, thy soul, the fixed foot, makes no show to move, but doth if the other do. So you're not stirring. But imagine, if you can imagine that compass tracing the circle on the paper, the fixed foot, the point, the spike, is staying in place, but of course it's moving in tune with the faraway foot, which is tracing the circle. It's revolving on its point to follow the fixed foot. So we are in sync with one another. We are connected to one another. You're the stationary element or part of the compass. I'm the moving one. And he goes on to say, though it in the center sit, yet when the other far doth roam, it leans and hearkens after it, because of course they're joined at the top by this screw, and grows erect as that comes home. So one day the compasses will be folded back together, and side by side the two legs of the compass. But until that happens, you will be attuned to me as I move. So he says, such wilt thou be to me, who must, like the other foot of the compass, obliquely run. So I've got to trace the circle, but we are connected, and you are in tune with me. He says, thy firmness makes my circle just, and makes me end where I begun. So these are high compliments he's paying her at the end of the poem through this strange metaphor of the compass. He's saying that if I can trace the circle and end where I begun so that the circle is complete and whole, I can do that because you are there in the center. If you take the one leg of the compass up and pull it out of the paper, then you're just an idiot trying to draw a circle freehand. The circle can be made and made perfectly because of the fixed foot in the center. Because of the fixed foot in the circle, the center, my circle is true, and I will come back home. I will end where I begun. I couldn't do that if you're not there. This may seem like a sort of thin valorization of the stay-at-homeness expected of a traditional woman. Maybe it is that, but it's also a real compliment in a culture that tends to equate femininity with inconstancy and to figure the male as constant, reliable. The woman is understood to be flighty and changeable, and sometimes, you get this in Shakespearean comedy. Sometimes, men are always afraid of being cuckolded because women fall in love with other men and are inconstant, whereas, the man is solid as a rock, supposedly. But Donne's giving his wife, who has to stay at home, he's giving her credit for being the firm one who allows him to come home safely and truly and makes his return, as well as the tracing of his circle, true and possible. And so in this beautiful poem, we have a bunch of unexpected ways of suggesting comfort in this moment of grief and fear. And we get this picture of a relationship which has endured. He doesn't talk, and of course we're on our 7th pregnancy or anything like that. He doesn't talk about that. He doesn't make it concretely clear that this is his wife. It's the sleuthing of literary historians that gives a decent shot at attempting to date this poem to a certain point in his life. But what there is in this poem, in spite of the sort of concrete detail, biographical detail, there's a sense of a relationship which, First of all, the poet figures it as such a deep one, and that is always his ideal. Again, even when he's talking about random women, he wants something more from them than just from their bodies. But when he's talking to his wife now, or imagining that he's talking to his wife through the page, he is telling her that the depth of connection we have makes us different. And if there's a rhetorical play there that has to do with, just being able to get up on his horse and get moving, because that's what his job demands, there's also a sensitivity here to this moment where she might cry or he might cry, and they'd both prefer to avoid that if possible. Because sidewalks aren't the best place for great displays of emotion. At least not of the sad variety. Maybe when he comes home, they can both afford to lose it a little bit. Anyway, this is an example of love poetry from this era in the English Renaissance that is so different from that of Sidney's, and beautiful in such a different way. But I hope you've enjoyed this little introduction to John Donne. As I say, before very long we'll have to look at his religious poetry, which is equally unexpected and equally brilliant. But that was John Donne for now. So thank you very much for spending some time with us. On behalf of Eric Williams, this is David Anderson wishing you all the best. Goodbye.